Vice President Yemi Oshibajo calls for closer cooperation among developing countries. More than 5,000 poor and vulnerable people in the Federal Capital Territory get stipends from government. Oil prices gain after Federal Reserve policy meeting. Verify Twitter users to pay $8 monthly bill to retain the blue badge. This is Business Express on the network service of the NTA, and we are reaching you from Abuja, the nation's capital. I am Musa Abubakar. The global economy, climate change, and the Ukraine conflict all present opportunities for closer ties among developing economies, especially in refocusing attention on trade and energy access for the benefit of the people. Vice President Yemi Oshibajo stated this when he received an audience the Nigerian-born Secretary General of the D8 organization, Ambassador Isiaka Imam. Speaking on the need for closer ties among developing countries, such as those in the D8, the Vice President said this is a very important time for member countries to really focus on the critical issues on trade and energy. Nigeria offers great prospect for expanding trade among the D8 members. Vice President Yemi Oshibajo explains and urged members to look at how to use Nigeria as a point to take off from and some kind of entryway into the African free trade zones. Ambassador Isiaka Imam remarked that there is a deliberate effort to reinvigorate trade among member countries and the new direction of the D8, especially improving trade volumes from $121 billion to a new target of about $500 billion by 2030. Now, the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAP's 7th General Assembly, is being hosted by Nigeria, and precisely Federal Inland Revenue Service is in the saddle. Logan Worth is the Executive Secretary, African Tax Administration Forum, and spoke on the proceedings and expectations with Abolade Salami in Lagos. That discussion on the sidelines of the General Assembly is next.
Mr. Logan, it's a pleasure having you on this interview session once again. When it comes to taxation in Africa, generally, it becomes headache because the way they see Africa, that we're very poor when it comes to tax collection. When we talk about Nigeria, we're still grappling with 6% of GDP when it comes to tax collection. But now let's look at Africa. Now, heads of tax forum are here in Nigeria, Lagos to be precise, to look at the 7th General Assembly. Tell us in key terms, what are those areas you'll be focusing on in view of addressing issue of taxation in Africa?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. It's good to be in Lagos, it's good to be in Nigeria. Heads of tax from across the continent will be gathering here over the next 4 days to essentially look at revenue strategies for Africa. This week, we're going to look at what we call the human face of tax administration. COVID-19, the war in the Ukraine, the depression of African and the global economy has made a huge gap in government budgets and the ability to fund development. There's a lot of pressure on governments around the world, and in Africa particularly, to find the money to build its infrastructure and to especially deal with poverty and poverty reduction. So over the next few days, we will look at what type of revenue strategies can African countries embark on in addition to the type of economic, macroeconomic and microeconomic policies and business policies we have to grow our economies. So this conference will look at a number of key topics. First would be the broader issue of domestic resource mobilization. Where in African economies do we find the money in the place where the economy is not producing? In Morocco, for example, growth is only 1%, but there's a positive growth of GDP. In South Africa, there's a positive growth of GDP. In Kenya, in Nigeria, there's limited growth, but there's growth. In most of the continent, growth is negative. And when growth is negative, there is far less money to collect out of the economy. The consequence of all of this is that African states have to borrow, or they have to live on aid. The problem with living on aid is that the war in the Ukraine has made the finances of European countries a lot more stringent because they're spending a lot of money on defending their own interests. So official development aid to Africa is shrinking. In addition to that, the amount of money that African countries have to borrow to fund those budgets are incredibly expensive. It takes a generation to pay off a loan. In other words, if you borrow $1 billion US, it takes you 20 years to pay it off. If you borrow $1 billion every year, it takes you an additional 20 years for each year that you borrow. So children who are still to be born are born into debt because their tax money, the things they produce in your country, the first part of that money must be paid off in debt. So that is what this meeting will be looking at. Firstly, at a theoretical level, what is the landscape? It's the landscape of borrowing, it's a landscape of aid, but it's also a landscape in which the African Union has put together an agenda that says by 2063, Africa must finance at least 90% of all its needs. At the moment, the average country on the continent cannot pay for half of the things that's in its budget. And that is what the first part of this meeting is going to be. So we today, in our second session of this conference, will be looking at what citizens can expect for the money that they pay and what the state is supposed to give them for the money that they pay. And if there is a disjuncture, what is the consequence of that for the ability of the state, for citizens to be tax compliant, to want to pay tax? Tax to GDP ratio in Nigeria is around 6% right now. About 3-4 years ago, it was 3%. Nigeria is one of the richest countries on the continent in terms of oil production. But Nigeria imports its petrol. Some of the things don't make sense. Not only for Nigeria, I'm just making an example because I am in Nigeria. And so, how does all of these things work in the way citizens understand and businesses understand what their tax money is buying? So that is what we will be discussing, because we believe the better the quality of spend by the state, the better people are willing to give you tax money. So tax compliance is a consequence of good service.
For any government to achieve or implement annual budgets that are presented, they need taxation, they need tax, they need revenue, so that it will reduce our borrowing. Like you rightly said, most countries are not even willing to borrow African countries now, because the rate at which they say we borrow is on the high side, because we're not generating revenues. As a forum of heads of taxation, what are those things you think have served as loopholes or hindered growth in revenue collection in Africa that has continuously led our leaders to go out to look for money? As a forum, have you sat down to think, what are those things that is hampering our success in revenue collection that this forum is looking to address?
Thank you. There's the issue of revenue collection and the issue of revenue generation.
Yes.
At the level of revenue collection, the things that hinder us in Africa particularly is that we've got very narrow tax bases. If you have 150 million people in Nigeria, it's useful to ask FIRS 250 million, 100 million more than I thought. If you ask FIRS How many people are on your tax register? Then you will see the gap. I am from South Africa. There's about 56 million people, but the tax register only has 7 million. So where's the other people? So the one issue to your question is the gap between those who must pay tax and those who are paying tax is wide. So one of the issues, we must broaden the register and bring the people that must pay tax into the tax net. Second, in Africa, politically connected people, high net worth individuals, certain parts of the religious sector, with the greatest respect, do not pay tax. The highest earners in Africa often don't pay tax. But the plumber and the fixer of the mechanic who earns 500 naira must give 200 in tax. So part of the problem of the continent is we must tax high net worth individuals, we must tax politically connected individuals, we must tax everybody at the same level throughout the continent. So that is the one impediment that will help us. Secondly, there is a culture within the continent and a belief, and a genuine belief, that if you provide tax incentives for foreign companies, they will invest in your country. So we give away tax money. Those countries get tax holidays for up to 10 years, sometimes renewable. So they don't pay tax, but we benefit because there's jobs, they buy, they use petrol, they pay VAT and so on. In the bigger scheme of things, if we do the cost-benefit analysis between the tax we forfeited and the rest of the benefit of having them here, in most cases, we have paid them for being here because we don't do the cost-benefit analysis. So tax incentives, bad tax incentives, non-transparent tax incentives, is often the reason why we lose a lot of money. I must also talk to you in the same context of your question about the issue of people borrowing, lending money to African countries. There are rating agencies, and these rating agencies is like those credit companies that rates you when you may open an account. It looks at your record, your ability to pay, the assets you own, and then it will give your neighbor an interest rate of 5% on the loan. But it will ask you to give 9% because you are higher risk. And those risks are normally calculated on things like political stability, the amount of change that's in the country, whether there's turmoil, and your record of paying back. And part of the difficulty with the revenue is when a country is not stable, there's coup d'etats every week, there's political infighting, there's war, there's terrorism, there's insurgencies, then the risk associated with your country increases. So the cost of borrowing, instead of being 2%, is now 11%. So whatever you now collect, that 11% must first go. That's just the interest. So if you borrowed 100, you can pay that 11%, you'll still owe 100. Because unless you pay more like you pay a bond, your debt is not going to come down. The second part of it is, when African countries borrow money, and they use it for capital expenditure, building infrastructure, building factories, building things that is going to produce money, it's a great thing. But when they borrow money to do current expenditure, to pay salaries, to invest in projects that doesn't generate income, then where they're going to get the next batch of money to pay for those things because no income has been generated. So on the one hand, the cost of running increases, the ability to collect decreases, and you end up with a very unstable situation.
But how do you think Nigeria can take proper advantage of its market size, its population, to increase its revenue base?
I always think of China when I think of Nigeria. China, poor country, no longer poor. China Most of US's debt that they owe to the world, they owe to a country like China. Because China understood, having billions of people, what that means. And one of the things they did was to build cities, was to grow their domestic markets. Their own people became the money generators, first of all. If you concentrate your economic development around big cities only, then everybody's going to go there. The big cities is going to overflow. But if you take your numbers and you make more cities and you build trains to link those cities, there's going to be markets along the road. People are going to manufacture along the road. And if they can get what they're making, plastic bottles, whatever they're making, if they can get it onto a train, to a ship that can take it to a market outside of Nigeria, then your numbers work for you. If you only target your market outside and you only target it within a few key economic hubs and you don't spread the wealth, you don't have to spread the wealth by everybody having to be a millionaire. But if the person who grows small crops has the ability to transport some of that crops to a market where other people can buy it, you are starting to create economic activity. If the person who generates electricity from water at home can get the ability to generate electricity for 200 houses, and you make the legislation possible with the safety regulations, you then have a 250 million population working for you. I think that part of it is not only collecting revenue from 250 million people. The bigger part of it is to generate an economy in which your main clients are those citizens. Your citizens are your assets. And for Africa, the biggest asset are the people between 14 and 24. They're the majority. They're not all getting education. They're not all getting the wealth and the nice things that those of us in the cities get. But empower them to be economically free and give them the economic and infrastructure facilities to trade, and you'll create a different generation. And then you collect more tax too.
Thank you, Mr. Mom. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
That's the African Executive Secretary, African Tax Administration Forum, Logan Watts, speaking to Abolade Salami, our correspondent in Lagos. Now, moving on, soccer has finally come to more than 5,000 poor and vulnerable people in the Federal Capital Territory. This is in the form of disbursement of stipends and grants to beneficiaries of social transfer and livelihoods under the COVID-19 Action Recovery and Economic Stimulus of the FCT. COVID-19 infection may be declining, but the impact on the poor and vulnerable in the society still lingers. Janet Kayode, a mother of 3, plays here to support her family.
Buhari, I'll go down, I'll come to the town and make hair. Sometimes we even have transport. I'll have to stay on the road. Please, can anybody, please, if I stop it.
Janet, along with more than 5,000 poor and vulnerable in the FCT, have now been selected to benefit from the social transfer and livelihood program under the COVID-19 Action Recovery and Economic Stimulus of the FCT.
Government says we want to support people so that some of them will be able to create jobs for themselves. People that are in business before, they'll be able to retain people on employment.
Give me a fish, they say I eat for a day. Teach me to fish, I'll eat for a lifetime. President Muhammadu Buhari is actually teaching us to fish. Hopefully, beneficiaries will eat for their lifetime.
Make judicious use of these grants and social transfers that has been given on to them in order to have a complete turnaround to their economic and social status.
Beneficiaries under the social transfer are entitled to a stipend of 10,000 naira a month for 1 year, while the livelihood beneficiaries are qualified for grants of 50,000 to 135,000 naira, depending on one's business. Now, the federal government owes contractors about 11.16 trillion naira for the construction of various highways across the country and certificates of completion. The Minister of Works and Housing, Babatunde Fashola, who made this disclosure while defending the proposed budget of his ministry in the 2023 appropriation bill, said his ministry had currently awarded 1,642 highways contracts for 1,632 projects at a total sum of 10.395 trillion naira. Oil prices rose in early trade on Wednesday after industry data showed a surprise drop in U.S. crude stockpiles, suggesting demand is holding up despite steep interest rate hikes. Dampening global growth, Brent crude futures picked up 0.1% to $94.82 a barrel in early trade, while U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude futures rose 0.3% to $88.63 a barrel. Both benchmark contracts rose about 2% in the previous session on a weaker U.S. dollar, and after an unverified note trending on social media said the Chinese government was going to consider ways to relax COVID rules from March 2023. Let's take a trip to the commodities market. Let's now join Nneka Oko for Global Stock Market Update.
Hello and welcome to the Global Market Review. U.S. stock futures rose marginally this Wednesday as investors brace for the Federal Reserve's latest policy decision at the conclusion of its meeting later in the day. The Federal Reserve is widely expected to deliver a fourth 75 basis point rate hike to contain stubborn high inflation. Now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average advanced just 5 points. S&P 500 traded 0.09% higher, and the Nasdaq Composite was up by 0.19%. European markets were mixed as investors focused on the Federal Reserve's next move. The DAX was off 0.03%, the FTSE also declined 0.02%, while the French CAC gained 0.29%. In Asia, stocks were also mixed. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index was halted after gaining 2.41% in earlier trade following the issuance of a typhoon warning. The Shanghai Composite also reversed losses to gain 1.15%, and the Nikkei 225 in Japan declined 0.06%. Markets like their Asian and European counterparts also traded mixed. The JSE Africa Top 40 and Namibia's overall index both rose fractionally. Kenya's Nairobi All Share and the Tune Index declined, while Ghana's GSE Composite was flat. And that's Global Markets Review. I am Nneka Oko.
Now, in a series of tweets this Tuesday, new Twitter head Elon Musk has announced a slash of Twitter verification fee from $20 per month to $8. Stephen King had earlier tweeted that he will not be paying the monthly $20 bill, adding that if it gets instituted, he will be gone and Twitter should pay him. However, Musk responded that bills needed to be paid and Twitter cannot rely entirely on advertisers. This has, however, not ended the debate on why the blue badge should come with a fee. Now that wraps this midweek edition of Business Express. Remember to keep in touch with us, so do send in your comments, observations, and suggestions. Also be informed that all previous episodes are available on YouTube on the NTA's channel. You can also communicate with us via our various social media platforms. Business Express returns Thursday at 9:30 a.m. I'm Musa Abubakar.